The hearing will come to order. I'd like to thank the witnesses for participating in what promises to be a lively hearing. I look forward to hearing from you about our trade opportunities in Asia. And I want to thank Ranking Member Sherman. We approach trade quite differently, but I'm looking forward to having this debate and having a great group of testimonies from the members of the panel. The scale of our economic ties with Asia is vast. 3 of 7 of our top trading partners are in Asia. 3 of our top 6 holders of U.S. Treasury bonds is in Asia, where their combined ownership exceeds $2.5 trillion. Trade, especially U.S. economic and trade policy in the Asia-Pacific, will be one of the major issues this Congress will deliberate. Increased U.S. presence in the region through the Trans-Pacific Partnership would greatly improve the American economy, as well as provide considerable diplomatic and strategic benefits. Let me start out by saying we live in a globalized world. That's already happened. Nothing's going to change that, whether anybody here likes it or not. It's only right for the United States to take advantage of the opportunities that globalization can afford us, especially as it can improve the livelihoods of Americans and improve trade and labor conditions abroad. Excluding ourselves from a monumental trade agreement that has clearly distinguished itself from previous FTAs would be unproductive and detrimental to our interests in Asia. TPP would provide comprehensive and high-standard guidelines for trade and commerce in the Asia-Pacific. A robust and comprehensive TPP has the potential to improve our economy and provide consistency and stability in Asia. When Congress passes TPP, the world will know we are dedicated to economic prosperity through the facilitation of strong and inclusive rules-based, market-oriented economic growth. While the details of the trade agreement are still not public, I'm confident that TPP will address issues such as preventing state-owned enterprises from having an unfair advantage in a market, or setting clear rules of origin, or constructing safeguards to protect intellectual property. I'm also confident that TPP will also foster job creation by incentivizing industry to invest in domestic production and manufacturing. Opponents of free trade will say our country will be flooded with low-cost imports. It's important to note the United States already has relatively low tariffs and minimal other trade barriers, with 70% of our imports already duty-free. We should not be worried about imports flooding our market after TPP is passed. Instead, TPP will help lower trade barriers, U.S. manufacturers, and companies that we are seeking access to other countries, providing U.S. trade and investment opportunities with other countries. If the United States does not actively participate in a comprehensive multilateral agreement in Asia, we may lose out on opportunities for growth and influence in the region. China is leading the way in pushing for an alternative regional economic and trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which excludes the United States. Reports have indicated that negotiations may focus on broad issues and avoid sensitive areas, so it will be likely to be a lower standard trade agreement. Additionally, the agreement would facilitate intra-RCEP trade by lowering tariffs among participating countries, but it would exclude the United States from those trade benefits. As China takes the lead in proposing alternative economic futures for Asia at the exclusion of the United States, the TPP would reassert our presence in the region. Through TPP, we'd be able to shape rules and introduce U.S. practices to countries like Vietnam to improve conditions for human rights and labor practices, or provide environmental protection and intellectual property rights protection clauses. We would not see those types of provisions in a China-led trade agreement, I can assure you. China can allege that the United States is rebalancing to Asia purely to achieve military outcomes, but the successful negotiation and implementation of a TPP agreement will counter Beijing's notions that we're only focused on the security rebalance to Asia, as well as reassure our allies and our friends in the region that we are a reliable economic partner. After all, the United States has been and will continue to be a Pacific power. I look forward to hearing our distinguished witnesses this morning and hope they'll be able to address how the TPP would set guidelines that would improve our economic strength both at home and abroad, and tell us what steps are necessary for a successful outcome. I now yield to Mr. Sherman, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for his opening remarks, and then we'll move quickly to questions because we have a few members that have to get to airplanes. Thank you, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, we're having this hearing, and as many of our colleagues are leaving, and just because all the seats are not filled does not mean that this matter is not of critical importance. A look at the economics of the various trade deals leaves a stark picture. We were told that giving most favored nation status permanently to China would increase our trade deficit by $1 billion. That estimate was off by over 30,000%. We were told that the Korea deal would reduce our trade deficit. It increases it. And now we can't even find an economist who says that this deal will reduce our trade deficit or increase jobs. So instead, they're telling us that somehow this increases national income, but of course not the income of those who need jobs. The economic case for this agreement is so incredibly weak that even with the vast majority of economists already on the payroll of those who are pushing it, they can't make an economic case. And so we are given other reasons. We are told, isn't it wonderful to have a deal with the rules that came from the United States? And it is true that many of the approaches behind this agreement were written on Wall Street. That we should take pride in such rules is like turning to citizens from Madrid and saying, take pride in the Spanish flu. Because these rules have decimated the millions and millions of American middle-class families. We need fair trade, not what is called free trade. And the choice is not between the status quo and digging in further, but instead, we have the lowest tariffs, many of them we can raise, in an effort to force countries to adopt fair trade, results-oriented trade agreements. When you're in a hole, and we have the biggest trade deficit hole imaginable, it's time to stop digging. Then we're told, oh, well, yes, it's a terrible economic deal, but think of how it helps us geopolitically against China. No, this is a deal that helps China. First, look at the rules of origin in the Korea agreement and what we would expect to see as rules of origin here. Goods that are 65% admitted made in China, which means they may be 70, 80, 90% made in China. They get a made in Korea tag put on them. That's the value added in Korea. They come into our country duty-free, and we get no benefits, no access to the Chinese market. This is a free trade agreement on steroids with China one way. Then the agreement says nothing about currency manipulation, so it enshrines the Chinese idea that currency manipulation is just fine. And those who violate the law by refusing to designate China as a currency manipulator come up with a PowerPoint presentation to show me that China is cheating, but they're cheating less. So let's not do anything about that. Folks, imagine trying that on your spouse. Honey, I'm cheating less. Here's my PowerPoint demonstration, mistresses per month, sharply declining. Wouldn't work. Cheating less is not a good way to argue that we should continue this process. So the idea that we can give away jobs and that proves how geopolitically strong we are is rather crazy. And finally, we look at statistics. Every time a statistic points in the direction this costs jobs, I hear, they hire a dozen economists to tell me, well, that statistic, you don't like that statistic, got a flaw. What you also see is that if a deal increases our imports by $2 billion and increases our exports by $1 billion, we're told it's a great deal because it's $3 billion more in trade. Or we're told it's a great deal because it's $1 billion more in exports. Nobody, I'm a CPA. I don't expect everybody to be CPA, but even in elementary school, you learn how to add, but you also learn how to subtract. And the fact is that if exports help, imports have the opposite effect. Finally, Secretary Kerry in this room said that this deal will not be a race to the bottom. Then why are we including Vietnam? 30 cents an hour. That is the bottom. And we're told, well, this deal will get us free access to their markets. Vietnam has no freedom and has no markets. And so finally, Secretary Kerry says, oh, but we will have labor standards in this agreement. I will want to hear from our witnesses whether they would sell a life insurance policy to someone trying to exercise labor rights in Vietnam. And if so, I am going to make sure that they are never allowed to work for an insurance company or an insurance regulator. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. We have a very distinguished panel of 4 experts today, and we're just thrilled that you could be here. Thank you, and thank you for your patience. Dr. Claude Barfield is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Barfield covers trade, intellectual property, and technology policy, and was previously a consultant for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Ms. Tammy Overby currently serves as Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She is also the President of the U.S. Korea Business Council and has spent decades living in Asia. Thank you. Mr. Scott Miller is a Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He holds the Center's William M. Scholl Chair in International Business and previously served in roles with the U.S. Trade Representative and Department of State. Thank you, Mr. Miller. And Ms. Celeste Drake is the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist at the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. Ms. Drake, a lawyer, previously served on congressional staffs and as a judicial clerk. Thank you, Ms. Drake. And we're going to start with you, Dr. Barfield, and then we'll move to my right, to your left. That's not political spectrum or anything like that necessarily. But we're really appreciative to have you here. You all understand the lighting system. When it goes amber, you've got a minute left. We're going to try to stick to those times because we'd like to get as many questions as we have, and we have a couple of members who are trying to beat it out before the snowstorm. So thank you very much, Dr. Barfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for inviting me. I will be happy to answer some of your and Mr. Sherman's questions on the economic side, but because of when talking with the staff and because this is the Foreign Relations Committee and not the Ways and Means Committee, my testimony is largely on the geostrategic implications of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other regional agreements. And I'll be very briefly, and I'll start with a quotation from Thomas Schelling, a Nobel Prize winner of a couple of decades ago, who said that the stakes of U.S. trade policy have always reached beyond the economic realm. Trade is what most international relations are about. For that reason, trade policy is national security policy. The point in my longer testimony that I try to make is summed up in this kind of theme, that whatever Mr. Schelling thought about trade policy and economic policy, trade policy really stands at the intersection between what one might say is the high diplomatic and security policy, our national interest in that regard, whether it's in terms of an individual other nation or a region, and domestic politics. How will these trade agreements affect our workers, our businesses? And that juxtaposition is something that presidents since the late 1980s, when the United States moved away from just having a trade policy that was with the GATT and then ultimately the WTO, to trade policies that really affected individual nations and now the regions. And so in the 1980s and to the Obama administration, when the Obama administration is trying to decide who we will have a trade agreement with and for what reasons, yes, the trade representative is there, but so is representatives from the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Commerce, from EPA, from other cabinets and other sub-cabinet arrangements. The point is that this affects interests that are beyond just our economic interests. And this goes back and I will quickly come up to the Obama administration. I mean, this started particularly with what we're looking at today with the TPP in terms of Asia, with the Secretary of State James Baker under the first George Bush, who reacted to a proposal by Japan and Malaysia to have an intra-Asian regional agreement by saying famously that the United States does not intend to allow a line to be drawn down the middle of the Pacific with us on one side of it and the nations of Asia on the other. And you move forward from the Bush administration to the Clinton administration, where with NAFTA, with APEC, with the free trade of the Americas, you had a strong push also to push democratic values, changing political institutions as well as the economic underpinning. With the Bush administration and the post-9/11 period, trade policy became a part of the white defense paper in 2003. So that you've had, across different administrations, this connection between geostrategic policy on the one hand and trade policy on the other. Let me just briefly talk about the Obama administration, because it's the most fascinating, I think, example. Famously, Mr. Obama came into office saying that he would have opposed NAFTA. He did not agree with the Bush trade agreements that had been negotiated after 2001. And yet within several years, the president himself and his administration turned around. Part of that, admittedly, the first year they were dealing with an economic crisis, part of that was economic. The president's advisors kept pushing him, saying that trade, and certainly exports and more trade agreements, will really help our economy. It's a plus to what we're doing domestically. But the other thing that occurred was that in the Pacific area, the diplomatic and security situation was deteriorating. It was when Mr. Obama came to office that you began to have this increased activity of North Korea, of launching missiles across the East and South China Sea, of threatening Japan. And it's the same time that China changed from the so-called peaceful development to a much more vigorous and assertive and belligerent policy. So it was actually cutting across our relations with some of our, as we see it even today, with some of our chief allies, with the Japanese, with the Philippines, with even Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So that really what the administration faced was, as it preached to the world that we were pivoting and that we were rebalancing in Asia, if you did not have an economic component, which is what the TPP really stands for, the Asians would really not take you quite seriously as they do now with the TPP, and if it becomes a successful agreement. So that we find the Obama administration really in some ways has come full circle, and this starts with the president himself, who, to his credit today, I think is really, he said a year or so ago that he was all in for the United States as Pacific power. He is, I think, all in for the TPP, and I congratulate him for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Overby.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and share our views of our members. I believe all of us can agree that economic growth and creating good jobs are the nation's top economic priorities. Approximately 17 million Americans are unemployed, underemployed, or have given up looking for work. Participation in the workforce stands at 63%, the lowest level since 1978, reflecting a significant level of discouragement. There are many policy options Congress will consider to improve this dire situation. International trade should be prominent among them. After all, outside our borders are markets that represent 80% of the world's purchasing power, 92% of its economic power, and 95% of its consumers. The most immediate and important trade opportunity before us is the topic of this hearing, the 12-country Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. This agreement would link countries in North and Latin America with important markets in Asia, representing nearly 40% of global GDP. As U.S. companies scour the globe looking for consumers, Asia stands out as brimming with opportunity. Over the last 2 decades, the region's middle class grew by 2 billion people, and their spending power is greater than ever. That number is expected to rise by another 1.2 billion people by 2020. According to the IMF, the world economy will grow by over $21 trillion in the next 5 years, with nearly half of that growth in Asia. U.S. businesses, workers, and farmers need better access to those lucrative markets if they're going to share in this dramatic growth. But American companies are falling rapidly behind in Asia. While U.S. exports to Asia increased steadily from 2000 to 2010, America's share of the region's imports declined by about 43%. In fact, the growth in U.S. exports to Asia lagged overall U.S. export growth in that period. One reason many companies have lost market share in Asia is that many countries maintain steep barriers against U.S. exports. A typical Southeast Asian country imposes tariffs that are 5 times higher than the U.S. average, while its duties on our ag products soar into the triple digits. In addition, a web of non-tariff and regulatory barriers block market access in many of these countries. Trade agreements are crafted to overcome these barriers, and without them, U.S. goods and services and the workers that provide them will continue to be blocked from these lucrative opportunities. But the U.S. disadvantages do not end there. Other countries are plowing ahead with trade deals that are leaving America on the outside looking in. China, India, and 14 countries are negotiating a trade deal called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that does not include America. This agreement does threaten to draw a line down the Pacific and put American workers, farmers, and businesses that you represent on the wrong side of history. The TPP is not only America's best chance, it is our only chance to ensure that America is not left out as these countries in the most economically dynamic region of the world pursue new trade accords among themselves. Unlike RCEP or the many 350-plus trade agreements already in force around the globe, the TPP promises to set high new standards and establish new rules for trade and investment that will generate greater benefits for all participating countries. TPP is a chance to introduce groundbreaking disciplines in emerging areas so that trade and investment rules can keep pace with a rapidly evolving global economy and increasingly sophisticated behind-the-border measures that governments are increasingly using to block our access and obstruct market-based competition. In order to provide American workers, farmers, and companies with these opportunities, Congress must first approve legislation to renewed trade promotion authority. Without TPA, we simply cannot enter into new agreements. We're excited to see that Congress and the administration are focused on TPA and working hard to prepare legislation to renew it in the coming weeks. TPA is a critical element of an economic policy which spurs economic growth and job creation in America. The agenda is clear. The U.S. cannot afford to sit on the sidelines while others design a new trade architecture for Asia. A comprehensive, ambitious, and enforceable market-opening TPP has the potential to create an explosion of trade and new American jobs and would demonstrate continued U.S. leadership across this important region. It's an exciting vision which, on the right terms, can be an economic shot in the arm for the United States and for our friends and allies in the region. It can send a clear, unmistakable message that Americans' leadership is in the Pacific to stay. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce looks forward to working with the members of this committee to secure a commercially strong TPP as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, for the opportunity to present my thoughts on prospects for the TPP. I believe a completed TPP would be beneficial to U.S. interests. First, it would form the largest free trade area in which the U.S. participates, with the opportunity to expand its membership. Second, it would establish a modern set of commercial rules for the Asia-Pacific where U.S. firms have a large and growing interest. Third, it would reinforce U.S. presence in the region. It's an important economic complement to our security posture. The United States has compelling economic interests in the Asia-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific, as defined by the 21 APEC economies, would be home to 3 largest economies in the world, the United States, China, and Japan. In addition, there are 15 economies worldwide with over $1 trillion of gross domestic product. 8 of those 15 are APEC members. This is an area which has, over the past decade or two, has demonstrated very strong economic growth and relative stability. Among the 21 APEC economies, there is already a high level of economic integration. There are many regional trading arrangements, of which the United States is a party to a few of them. But there's about $10 trillion a year in goods and services traded around the Asia-Pacific. TPP holds the promise of 3 major benefits to the U.S. economy: modernized rules, improved market access, and a durable new commercial architecture in this fast-growing region. Let me focus in particular on the rules because it came up in your opening comments. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned globalization and the fact that this economic change is a given in our lives. I think the point that I would make is over time, trade rules made for a different time become either outmoded or incomplete for changes wrought by this technology. We certainly live at a time of great technological progress. The technological progress, particularly in transportation, communication, and information flows, have led to rapidly falling barriers in the flow of goods, people, ideas, and culture. It's something globalization is the usual way to refer to it. But this technological change has changed both the way we trade and what we trade. How has it changed the way we trade? Well, 50 years ago when the GATT was founded and shortly after, most international exchange took in the form of arm's-length transactions between unrelated parties. What technology allows today, particularly communication and information technology, is a very high degree of firm-to-firm coordination in trade. The UNCTAD estimates that 80% of global merchandise trade is actually firm-directed. So the unrelated party transactions that were the basis of the GATT are no longer the reality of modern trade. So how we trade today and the way we operate is organized around global value chains and firm communication. So it's a very different mode of operation. In addition, what we trade has changed. Because of technology, some goods and services previously thought non-tradable, including, say, accounting services, are now, in fact, tradable goods. More importantly, there are goods that, frankly, didn't exist 20 years ago when the last round of the GATT was completed that are now in the traded system. A good example is digital services. In 1994, there was essentially no commercial use of the internet. At that time, digital trade exports, or digital services exports from the United States were insignificant. Today, digital services exports are roughly double agricultural exports for the United States. In 2011, digital services exports were $356 billion versus $136 billion of total farm exports. So we have types of trade today that were unimagined even at the time of the last GATT round. Modernizing rules in areas like cross-border data flows and regulatory cooperation are critical to the way the modern trading system functions. That's really one of the important reasons for being at the table in TPP. They're vital to U.S. firms, which are often on the leading edge of this commercial innovation. As Tammy mentioned, TPP will also improve market access for U.S. exporters, particularly in the 5 partner economies where we do not have FTAs now. And finally, TPP is intended to have an open architecture, expected to incorporate new members, which will help reinforce U.S. high standards for commerce in the region and have positive spillover effects for the United States, our allies, and our partners in the region. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Drake.
Thank you. Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the committee, good afternoon. I appreciate this opportunity to testify on the prospects for greater trade under the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership. I have submitted written testimony for the record and will summarize my comments here. I'm going to start with a premise that some of you might find surprising, and that's that America's workers support trade, and in fact, we want more of it. While it's true that we oppose the recent Colombia and Korea trade deals, it's also true that we strongly support GSP and AGOA, which promote imports through tariff reductions. For us, the real question is not whether to trade, but how to trade. In other words, what rules will govern and who benefits. Some say the TPP is a fight between the US and China to write trade rules. It's not that simple. Is the we really the people of the United States writ large? Or is it global corporations, many of whom invest in and produce in China, and other economic elites who hold about 90% of the US trade advisor seats? For China, a real problem is getting it to abide by any rules. 14 years after China joined the WTO, it is still not compliant. And why would new rules be any different? For the nearly 13 million working families the AFL-CIO represents, the question we ask is whether, taken as a whole, the Trans-Pacific Partnership will make lives better for people who work. There is little doubt that a completed TPP will increase trade flows, which do not necessarily mean better lives for workers. Better wages and working conditions do. Trade rules from NAFTA onward have contributed to stagnant wages and increasing inequality. How can a trade deal help? The most important thing the TPP can do to help create jobs and raise wages is to address currency manipulation. A Japanese official recently warned that such a move would kill the TPP. But we have real doubts about the value of a TPP that fails to address currency. This is critical. If the TPP leaves countries free to use currency to create trade advantages, the mammoth, job-killing, $500 billion U.S. trade deficit is only likely to grow. We are also looking for commercial rules that will help reduce the deficit. This means strong rules of origin on everything from cars and car parts to aerospace parts and clothing. It also means meaningful, easy-to-use rules to prevent unfair competition from government-subsidized firms that compete against our firms, for instance, by producing steel products. It also means intellectual property provisions that strongly support American innovation and creativity without putting health at risk or bleeding taxpayers dry. We support balanced investment rules, not investor-to-state dispute settlement. ISDS sets up a separate but unequal system of justice that operates outside U.S. courts and U.S. law, available to foreign investors only. This corporate court undermines the ability of elected officials to make policy choices. And though the quality of a trade deal does not turn solely on labor provisions, inadequate standards, poor enforcement, or both contribute to an economic imbalance that leaves workers behind. The TPP's labor rules must require compliance on day one, or it sends the message that the commitments aren't serious. If the TPP's labor rules are entirely discretionary, allow for infinite delays, or no action at all, they will not help workers gain the voice they need to raise wages and make their jobs safer. The GAO has already recognized inadequate U.S. oversight and monitoring of labor provisions in prior trade deals, even ones using the so-called May 10th standard. Workers, whether in Mesa, Arizona, Mexico City, or Hanoi, cannot afford to have their governments ignore fundamental human rights, including the right to join together and seek a better life. Some of the TPP countries are extremely troublesome in this regard, whether that means restricting the right to free speech, to join a union, arresting people who wear Santa hats, or stoning homosexuals. All of these raise concerns about the ability of these countries to be fair trading partners, to meet international standards, and to develop an economy with the basic fairness to create a functioning middle class. These are human rights questions, moral questions, but also deeply economic questions. To us, the questions about the TPP are far too complex to merit a grant of fast track, which requires Congress to commit sight unseen to an up or down vote with limited debate. That's why we urge you to increase your leverage over the TPP by rejecting the unaccountable fast track model. We cannot afford to get this wrong. I thank the committee for its time and would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Drake. I'm going to start it off with a round of questions. My first question would be that the administration often mentions 21st century trade issues as a goal of TPP. What are these issues, and why are they important to the U.S. economy? Dr. Barfield, would you like to take a first crack at it?
I think Scott went into this to some degree. They are issues that he talked about in terms of the new digital economy, of moving. And I should say that what has happened is that as the trade negotiations have gone over the decades, you've gone from trade barriers such as tariffs that were outside the border to the kinds of things that you find inside the border, of regulations. And now we have new technology such as the new digital economy, which trade rules to date have not handled. And so the 20th century, the term 20th century agreement means that you're really looking at issues that had not been looked at before or only briefly looked at, such as regulatory issues, whether it's health and safety, whether it's environment or whatever. So it's kind of, it is an inside the border and regulatory framework that you're trying to change in the direction of allowing a free flow of trade and investment.
Thank you. Ms. Overby, did you, or Mr. Miller, did you want
If I could add briefly, yes, I agree with Claude. Classically defined as the electronic commerce and telecom issues, cross-border data flows being the most important for business operations, not just internet firms and high-tech firms, but all firms operate with a lot of coordination, and free flow of data is critical to operation. Second, in competition policy, which has been an older subject of trade, one of the things that's added in the TPP is the consideration of state-owned enterprises and how to treat state-owned enterprises when they and how to manage their competitive neutrality to make sure they operate the way that normal competitive companies do. I would also add regulatory cooperation or regulatory coherence is an important part. This is one of the behind-the-border issues that is a bigger part of trade frictions today than it was 1 or 2 decades ago. Finally, in the intellectual property chapter, there's good work going on safe harbors for internet service providers, which is consistent with U.S. law and practice, as well as measures to protect high technology innovators in foreign markets.
One other question, Mr. Miller. Would those safeguards on these issues, whether it's intellectual property or many of the other issues that you mentioned, would they happen if we're not part of it?
It's unlikely. The United States has raised these issues. Frankly, it's U.S. firms that are on the frontier of commercial innovation in these sectors. Mostly, in most trade negotiations, economies raise the issues that are most important in their industries. And for the U.S. companies, these come to a high level that probably wouldn't happen if we were absent from the TPP negotiations.
One of the arguments against TPP is that our trade deficit with FTA partners has actually increased in aggregate. However, my understanding is our overall trade deficit peaked in 2006 at $760 billion. Since then, it's actually decreased to $505 billion. So trade balances with FTA partners have actually improved, at least as far as I'm reading the statistics. Is the trade deficit issue of particular concern to the negotiators, and should it be? Ms. Overby, would you like to address that?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the trade balance is actually a poor measure of success of U.S. agreements. In macroeconomic terms, the U.S. overall trade deficit reflects an imbalance in our consumption and our savings, not our trade agreements. Until we save more than we consume, the U.S. will continue to run a deficit on a global basis. However, if we take as a group, the U.S. ran an aggregate trade surplus with its FTA partner countries in 2012 and 2013, and this surplus has grown since then. In fact, the U.S. has recorded a trade surplus in manufactured goods with its FTA partners for each of the past 5 years, according to our Department of Commerce. This surplus reached $27 billion in 2009 and has expanded to $61 billion by 2013.
Thank you. And then lastly, I just have time for one more question. The issue of currency manipulation. Is there any evidence that by itself currency manipulation is damaging to our economy?
I'm no expert on this matter, but I'll take the advice of Fed Chairman Janet Yellen, who was asked about currency manipulation in trade agreements at a recent Senate Banking Committee hearing. She mentioned, acknowledged the issue was an issue, but said that the United States had defensive issues here, and that doing her job of managing U.S. fiscal policy might be constrained if we were to negotiate this in trade agreements. I would note also, there are certain things that are important to trade and affect trade that we don't consider in trade agreements. I would note farm subsidies is one of those. I don't think there's any debate that farm subsidies do have an effect on farm pricing, but the United States has never negotiated them within a bilateral free trade agreement.
Ms. Overby.
Yes, we agree. Currency manipulation is a very serious problem in international trade, and we're encouraged that the administration and Congress are working to find solutions. The Chamber's view is that disputes over currency deserve a full airing, but the questions are, what's the right forum and what measures can be effective? Historically, governments have tackled currency matters in a very broad fora, such as the IMF, G20, or G7. This is because governments have seen currency valuation and current account imbalances as global in nature and not effectively addressed with a single partner or a small collection of partners. Most international policymakers and experts want to be sure that we don't tie the hands of the Fed or the Treasury Department with enforceable currency provisions in TPP or any U.S. trade agreement. Our institutions need to be able to determine our own monetary and fiscal policies and be able to respond in a crisis. The other TPP partners have, as Mr. Sherman mentioned, indicated that they do not want currency provisions in an agreement.
Thank you. I've run out of time. Mr. Sherman.
Okay. Just for the record, using ITC data, our trade relationship with our FTA partners, most recent statistics, $180 billion deficit in merchandise, plus 70, see I can add and subtract, billion on services. That's a $110 billion trade deficit with the FTA countries. I do serve on the House Financial Services Committee, and there is, and have for 18 years, there is a huge difference between setting your interest rates for your own national economic growth on the one hand, and intervening in currency markets to push down your currency and steal jobs on the other. And only when those two are conflated could somebody say, oh, we'd better not talk about currency manipulation. Somebody will try to tie the hands of the Fed. And I would point out that the statistics I gave you don't even count the re-exports, situations where goods are brought into the United States for transit, often to a Latin American country. We're told that this agreement is going to help us vis-a-vis our trade relation, vis-a-vis our national security relationship with China, but we're also told China might join the agreement. You can't argue it both ways, but when it comes to national security and China, and the idea of binding us to other Asian nations, let's look at the situation. We are already devoting all of our procurement and research dollars at the Pentagon to figure out how to fight China for the benefit of Japan, Korea, etc., over some relatively useless Pacific islets, rocks. And so we're going to spend and perhaps die for their territory, and now we have to give them a lot of jobs to get them to let us do it. That's, if being their security is not enough and we have to give up jobs, I'd be surprised. First, I want to thank the first three witnesses for not asserting that this agreement under consideration would lead to more jobs or would reduce the trade deficit, because it obviously won't. Ms. Overbly has made the point that workers are discouraged and they're not entering the workforce. The reason for that is low wages, and the reason for that is the trade policy that we've suffered. For every job we lose in these trade agreements, there are 10 others where people don't get raises because their employer is able to say, I may move to China, or I have to compete with China, or I have to compete with the free trade agreement from Korea, etc. And so wages are low, and you end up with low participation rates. As to national security is not just figuring out how to fight over rocks in the Pacific. It is also Iran. And there's one thing Obama and Netanyahu agree on, and that is the key thing here is sanctions. They just disagree on how to modulate them in order to get what they hope is a good deal. Under these fair trade agreements, those provisions of our sanctions aimed at U.S. contractors could be swept away. Dr. Barfield, is there anything in the agreement that you're aware of that will say that those U.S. sanctions, particularly government procurement sanctions, will be fully enforced notwithstanding the FTA?
Well, the government procurement is one of the things that's being negotiated in the
Okay.
TPP.
All of
What-
our past free trade agreements open giant loopholes in the #1 national security effort of this country, and that is imposing sanctions on Iran until we get a good deal. Ms. Drake, what's it like to be a labor organizer in Vietnam? And I realize just because you work for the AFL-CIO doesn't mean you're in the organizing department, but you might know some of those folks.
Good question. I mean, the real thing that you're risking that you're not necessarily risking here in the United States is you can be arrested. And when you're arrested, there are issues of extrajudicial killings and beatings by the police in Vietnam. But really, You just don't have the opportunity to say, we want our own union, we want an independent union, we want to get together and work with each other for better. There is one national federation, the VGCL, and it's really an arm of the government. And while it does function, it doesn't function as a union. It sort of makes sure that you get birthday cake at work when it's your birthday and things of this nature. It doesn't really function as a tool to say, workers here need more safety, they need more money, they need better benefits. These are the things that workers need.
A number of the witnesses gave us a tremendous picture of how Asia is big, important, dynamic, and growing in every respect. Couldn't agree with you more. That's why we needed to use the threat of dramatically increased tariffs, and even with the WTO, we can, whether we choose to or not, just impose them or threaten to impose them in order to secure free trade agreements. And so I look forward to us having the right trade policy toward this important and dynamic region. And finally, we have a huge trade deficit. We used to blame the U.S. federal deficit. Well, we ran a surplus under Clinton. We had a huge trade deficit. We have deficits at the federal level. We have a huge trade deficit. On rainy days, we have a trade deficit. On sunny days, we have a trade deficit. And so ultimately, we're told it's because your workers aren't producing products at a good price that the world wants to buy. And I would say we have the best workers in the world, we have the best scientists in the world, we have the best entrepreneurs in the world. But we have the largest trade deficit in the world because we have the worst trade policy in the world. I yield back.
I'd like to challenge that if I could. No one.
Well, I believe my time has expired.
All right, I will do it when somebody else asks a
Mr.
question.
Emmer.
Why don't you go ahead, Mr. Barfield, and then thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, the point is that nobody has said that the trade deficit causes jobs, or that the trade not here at any rate. I don't know what the AFL-CIO, what my colleague there would say, but as to keep coming back to something that, Mr. Chairman, you ignored, was Tammy's point that we have to keep coming back to. It's Economics 101, that we will run a trade deficit with the rest of the world overall as long as we do not save and invest and save enough both privately and publicly to cover our investments and what we are spending. And the United States has for the last several decades, not been able to do that. So we could you can change the trade deficit with China, or shift it toward Japan, or whatever way you want to do. But overall, as Tammy pointed out, it's the macroeconomic factors. You're still going to have a large trade deficit unless you change that. And we have been unwilling to do that. This is not to let China
Mr.
off
Barfield?
free.
Mr. Barfield, if you don't mind, and I appreciate it, maybe you can filter it in some of the others. I have just a couple minutes left, and I thank the chair for letting me ask a couple of questions. I'm from the state of Minnesota, and in 2013, Minnesota goods exported were $20.8 billion. Nationally, and this is not just Minnesota, jobs supported by exports reached more than 11 million in 2013. And every $1 billion of United States exports of goods supported an estimated 5,400 jobs in that same year. By the way, jobs supported by exports, goods that were exported, paid an estimated 13 to 18% above the national average. It's important to my state because 47% of Minnesota's exports, again, in that year, almost $10 billion went to countries that are currently part of this negotiation. Mr. Barfield, very quickly, I want to cover a couple of areas if I have time. First, I hear a lot of people, and I see some T-shirts here about fast-track authority. Under the Constitution, it's my understanding, Article 1, Section 8, that Congress has the sole authority to enter into agreements with foreign nations, whether they be treaties or trade agreements, and that the executive has only authority to negotiate. Is my understanding correct?
Yes.
Now, the idea that this is going to be sight unseen, and I'm going to move to Ms. Overby. There was a statement made, I think, by Ms. Drake that Congress, if it passes trade promotion authority, which is nothing more than legislation that tells the executive branch, this is what the expectations are, this is what we can do, what we can't do, this is what we will accept, what we won't. This is what Congress is doing to exercise its constitutional authority over trade. The testimony was made that this will somehow come to Congress sight unseen. In fact, the TPA legislation that would be part of this, if this is going to go forward, would require that you have full transparency. Isn't that right, Ms. Overby? And could you please explain what that would mean?
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely correct. I also find it somewhat ironic that critics of the TPP negotiations and specific chapters or provisions always criticize the lack of transparency in the negotiations. But in the very next breath, they say it's a bad agreement. If it's not transparent, I'm not sure how one knows whether it's good or bad. Also, calls to make confidential negotiating text public are, in my view, misguided. Disclosure of negotiating text would risk giving foreign governments a roadmap to U.S. sensitivities and red lines that could be used to our disadvantage. I was actually in Korea working for the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea when the U.S. and Korea were negotiating the KORUS FTA. And an opponent of the KORUS FTA from the Korean National Assembly leaked some text. And I saw firsthand that it provided our negotiators a clear picture of their strategy. And frankly, it helped us. We got a better deal from our perspective because of that.
Quickly, can you address the other claim that this is somehow going to affect jobs in this country? Because my understanding is the tariffs, in other words, the barriers to products coming into our country, are among the lowest in the world. And actually, we want to make sure that our labor, our greatest workers on the face of the planet, are able to produce and sell their products fairly in markets outside of our country.
You are exactly right. The U.S. already has one of the lowest tariffs in the world, and most of Asia has very high. In fact, in Southeast Asia, 5 times the tariff level to Americans. So our market's already open. If we do nothing, what that means is they keep selling to the U.S. and we can't sell to them.
Wouldn't that affect the trade deficit?
In a very negative way, exactly. And your point about jobs, you're absolutely right. It will have an impact. This agreement is a job-creating agreement because it's going to allow us to sell more, and when we sell more, we have to hire more people to do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, this entire discussion is very important, and you know, you mentioned looking at this is macroeconomics. There have been a lack of details that members have been able to share with people at home who have not a background in economics, but who are very interested specifically in how will this affect me and my family, our ability to support them, and to be able to have opportunity to create jobs. I want to touch on the compliance issue because I think it's a valid one. When we're talking about whether it's labor standards or environmental standards or other things that the administration has put out there saying, hey, don't worry, we're going to include, we're going to ensure that these standards are included. Really, there's not a great track record in history of such standards having been enforced either recently or in previous history. So I'd like to ask you, what gives you such great confidence that these standards, if met in the agreement, would be enforced, and what's the enforcement mechanism?
Well, I would just note that with regard to labor and environmental standards, we've actually come a very long way since the NAFTA. In the NAFTA in 1994, the labor and environmental provisions were so-called side agreements. They were not in the body of the text. They were basically voluntary cooperation agreements. Since that time, there have been a number of iterations in U.S. policy. We moved to a standard in 2001-2002, so-called the Enforce Your Own Laws. Thanks to the leadership of at that time, Chairman Levin and others, in the May 10th, 2007 agreement, there was a higher standard promulgated, which first tied the standards for labor and environment to international obligations, and second, allowed the same kind of dispute settlement mechanism as for any other violation of the free trade agreement. So the way our current law and our current negotiating policy operates is that the Labor and Environment chapter have equal standing with every other chapter in the trade agreement in terms of access to dispute settlement. There is a current live dispute settlement for the labor provision of the Central America Free Trade Agreement, which is happening in real time right now. So that'd be the easiest one to follow. But I would note importantly on the environmental side, an important advance is if any two parties to, say, the TPP are parties to a separate environmental accord, like the CITES agreement or some other environmental accord, and there is an alleged violation of that separate accord, that those parties can use the TPP dispute settlement chapter to settle the dispute of an outside agreement.
Thank
so
you.
I think we've made progress. Thank you.
Ms. Drake?
Thank you very much. I think in terms of compliance, it's a particularly important question. We have under CAFTA a complaint against Guatemala. There's actually several live complaints. The one against Guatemala has been going on for 6 years, and that means for 6 years, employers in Guatemala have been freely driving down wages by failing to pay minimum wage, by firing workers who try to form a union, by specifically not following the law. And while they're driving down wages in Guatemala, that means they're also driving down wages in nearby Honduras and El Salvador and Costa Rica, because it's one labor market. And by the way, they're also driving down wages here, because employers here say, if you don't take pay cuts, if you don't give back seniority rights, if you don't give up your pension plan, we're going to move production to Central America. So it's a critical issue. On the Honduras issue, which is also an open complaint, that one was open for 3 years, even before the administration responded. And they just put out a report last Friday. It's a great report. They may do some things to improve labor rights in Honduras, but meanwhile, workers on the ground are being abused every single day. And that sends the wrong message to our TPP partners about how seriously the labor commitments will be taken. But also, if the chapter doesn't include specific timelines, requirements to act on, complaints that have merit, then the problem is that any government that doesn't want to act, if it has unlimited discretion, can just ignore it. They can do far worse than delay for 3 years. This is an administration that cares about labor rights. What if we have an administration, President X, in 2017, who doesn't care at all about labor rights?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I must confess, part of my problem with this topic is we now have taken theological positions. So largely at AFL, almost no free trade agreement could ever be good. They're all bad. They all create dislocations, they kill jobs, they haven't worked out, and there's no reason to be confident that any enforcement mechanism would ever really work. Similarly, the Chamber of Commerce hasn't found one it doesn't like. And Ms. Overby, you've heard me give this sermon before, but Ms. Drake's last point, what confidence does somebody on my side of the aisle have that the Chamber would ever really seriously care about labor suppression overseas when the Chamber is actively engaged in funneling money to campaigns for labor suppression here at home? And so as someone like me who is inclined intellectually to be open to free trade, I couldn't possibly trust the Chamber, politically or substantively, to take that issue Ms. Drake has just given us seriously. You've given, not you personally, Ms. Overby, but the Chamber. I mean, if you got a D after your name, the Chamber's going to go after you. You might pick one or two, and I mean one or two token Democrats. And other than that, it doesn't matter what our free trade record is. There's no reward whatsoever coming out of your organization and Mr. Donohue. And so we vote for free trade at our peril. And I think, framing this issue theologically, and the political sort of brittleness that attends to that it does not contribute to a rational debate or discussion about the real merits and real problems associated with any free trade agreement. Mr. Miller, I take your point. I mean, you know, if you listen to the critics of NAFTA, it's a complete failure, and it didn't address these issues. And if that critique is seated, if that's true, then why would anybody have confidence in the argument, well, this time we got it right, trust us?
I'd like to turn that around if I
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Barfield, Dr.
That is,
Barfield.
let's
But
pick the
I'm going to
example.
ask you to move this closer to you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Let's take, sorry, it's on. I would turn that around and give the example that I did just in terms of geostrategic, but I would also do it in terms of the economics. Why was it that President Obama turned around? Why does he think this is a very progressive, a very liberal administration? And the president came into office saying that he would not have voted for NAFTA, and he didn't like the free trade agreements that the Bush administration. The TPP is building on that tradition, which causes the AFL-CIO a good deal of heartburn. But the president has turned around because he thinks that it is possible
Well,
to have agreements that
Dr.
help
Barfield,
business, and it is not the chamber we're talking about here. This is the leader of your party.
well, he's also the leader of the country.
Well, the
He's
country-
your president as well as mine.
I was not implying he wasn't. by any
I
means.
understand. I'm just thought I'd
I've
say
defended
I just thought I'd say that. But I would also point out to you that's not unique to this president. Name a president, Democrat or Republican, who hasn't come around to the idea that free trade makes sense and hasn't gotten behind free trade on.
Well, why do you think that is the case?
Well,
It's not the
Ms.
chamber.
Drake may have a point of view about that. You want to answer that?
I would like to answer.
Rhetorical question.
I would like to answer that. I think that you know, candidates in general, writ large, are saying what voters want to hear when they're running, and they get it. They hear people. They say, my wages have been stagnant. They say, you know, my uncle was laid off from a good factory job. They go to main streets and they see what's happening when a factory closes and a town dies out. And then you get into a position of power, and the choices that you make are different, and the influences on you are different. So it's, you know, it's disappointing when candidate after candidate runs in a particular way and then votes differently. But I would like to get to your question of, you know, the AFL-CIO is ideological on this, and I don't think.
And so is the chamber.
Well, look,
And if you're going to answer that, Ms. Overby has to be given
Sure.
the
I mean,
opportunity to.
we submitted 34 pages in January of 2010 of this is what the TPP should look like if we're going to support it, which, by the way, I also want to challenge Ms. Overby's comment that we're always saying it's a bad deal. What I said was the questions about the TPP are far too complex to merit a grant of fast track. The AFL-CIO has not taken a position for or against the TPP. We're certainly against using NAFTA as a model, using Korea as a model, using failed models as a model. And from what has been said publicly about the TPP, which is frankly very little in comparison to the voluminous number of pages, it is using NAFTA and Korea as a model.
Thank you. And by the way, the word was theological, not ideological. My background, I hear theology. If the chairman will just allow the chamber rep to respond similarly, and then I'm done.
Yeah, that's fine.
I thank the chair.
It's always a pleasure to see, as a constituent in Mr. Connolly's district, it's always a pleasure to see my member. So how are you?
Just every day is a holiday around here, you know.
Isn't it? I just want to make a couple very brief comments. You know where the chamber stands. You know how the chamber determines their political donations. I'm not the person to address that. But I do want to talk about failed agreements and why so little has been written about TPP. Again, the reality is the negotiation is ongoing. And frankly, a lot of what has been written from America is not helping America's negotiators. And if we all want the best deal America can get, I would think we would be standing behind the United States. To my colleague on the right, Dr. Barfield, why did President Obama change his view? Well, we work very closely with the administration on KORUS, on the Korea FTA, and I believe he changed his view because he felt he got a deal he could sell, a deal that improved the auto piece, and he was able to get not only Ford Motor Company, but if I'm not wrong, the UAW actually supported KORUS. But I will make and certainly admit that no trade agreement is perfect. We continue to try to improve upon it. I will say that the KORUS agreement is better than earlier agreements, particularly in the area of enforcement. 19 committees were set up under KORUS, and each one of those committees has a senior government-to-government working level meeting where we're able to raise our issues much faster. I believe the TPP will have even better enforcement mechanisms. I think our USTR representative is well aware that other countries are not always playing with the same level playing field, and so they're giving us our opportunity to try to improve it faster.
I think I'm going to have to cut that off, otherwise, Ms. Drake is. I will say my point about the chamber was much broader than who you contribute to. It was a pattern of exclusion that I think impinges on our ability up here to have a reward and punishment system that's a little more rational than it otherwise is on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Grayson.
Thank you. Ms. Drake, will the Trans-Pacific Partnership decrease or increase America's trade deficit?
It's impossible to know because it's mostly secret, but it seems likely poised to increase the U.S. trade deficit.
What makes you say that?
Well, for one thing, it doesn't deal, according to the president, with currency. And as Mr. Barfield was explaining before with trade deficits, what he didn't mention was that Basic Trade 101 theory says if a country is running trade deficits over time, currencies will fluctuate to account for that, and it will eventually even out. The United States is the only country that we know of in the history of the world that has had such large and sustained trade deficits over time. And while it's true that the United States has very low tariffs and very low trade barriers, the reason that we think we've seen floods of imports back in from certain trade agreements is not because the domestic firms in those countries are now exporting more than they could. It's often that production that used to happen in the U.S. has moved to a trading partner country, and then that offshored production is taking advantage of the lower tariffs to get those goods back into the U.S.
Ms. Overby, will the Trans-Pacific Partnership decrease or increase the U.S. trade deficit?
I believe it will decrease it because the studies seem to show that with our FTA trading partners, we tend to have surpluses.
Well, but isn't it true, Ms. Overby, that since NAFTA went into effect, the first of these major trade agreements, the United States has run a trade deficit of at least $135 billion every single year, and therefore doesn't it follow that if we continue to expand these trade agreements, we'll have higher and higher, not lower and lower trade deficits?
No.
No, I'm still with Ms. Overby there.
I'm not an expert in the NAFTA numbers, but everything I have heard and been told, no, those numbers are inaccurate.
You're saying that the numbers I just gave you are inaccurate?
May
the fact that that since NAFTA went into effect, every single year we've had a trade deficit of $135 billion or more? You're saying that's inaccurate?
I don't.
Nope, sorry, still with Ms. Overby. Sorry, let's stick with the witness here.
I'm sorry, I don't have that information.
Okay, now here's another little tidbit for you. In the last 14 years, we've run the largest trade deficits in the history of the planet. And in the last 14 years, we've followed these trade agreements and had an open trade policy. What makes you think that that would reverse itself under the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Okay, may I answer?
I'm asking you to answer.
I'd love to. Again, in macroeconomic terms, the trade deficit reflects the imbalance in consumption and savings. It's not our trade agreements. If you want America to have a trade surplus, may I suggest that the Congress pass a budget that is saving more than we spend?
Listen, I'm talking to you about the trade deficit, not the federal deficit, so don't change the subject. But let's continue it in this vein if we can. Since we adopted the trade policy starting with NAFTA and entered into these free trade agreements, our cumulative trade deficit is $11 trillion. That's over $35,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. For me and my 5 children, that's about $200,000. What makes you think that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is something like the 10th or 11th in a long series of these trade giveaways, is somehow magically going to reverse that pattern?
I don't think I can give you an answer that's going to change your mind.
Why don't you give me an answer that's accurate?
Okay, again, I believe that the overall trade deficit has nothing to do with the trade agreement. I think it's about the imbalance in our consumption and savings.
Okay, so you do think it's just this magnificent coincidence that since we adopted these policies, we've had this enormous, staggering trade deficits year after year?
No, I think it's because of the way we spend more than we consume more than we save, and also the U.S. dollar is the currency around the world. I mean, we are the reserve currency.
We were the reserve currency for the past 100 years, and it's only since NAFTA went into effect that this happened. What about you, Mr. Miller? What do you have to say about this subject?
Well, I would observe that the United States trade deficit fell by 46% in 2009 versus 2008.
Could that have something to do with the fact that we had a worldwide depression in
It
2008?
certainly did. It had everything.
Okay, so that
it had
you
everything
really,
to do with it.
but you're not playing fair,
If
are
I may
you?
finish.
You're coming up with a factoid that has nothing to do with my question.
My point is there was no change in trade policy year on year. There wasn't a change
No,
in
just
overall economic
a collapse of the world economy and then
collapse
a
in demand.
recovery.
Yes, so
yes,
I'm
right.
suggesting there are other factors involved in the overall trade deficit.
All right, my time's up. Thank you.
Now that the committee members, both majority and minority, have had an opportunity to question the witnesses, I ask unanimous consent to recognize Representative Marcy Kaptur. Hearing no objections, now recognize Representative Kaptur.
Chairman Salmon, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And I guess I'm just sitting here looking at what's going on in the world and being very thankful that we're citizens of this republic, and whether we agree or disagree, we're going to work this out. It's going to take us time because it really isn't working for America right now, our trade policy. But when we look at other places, I'm just thankful that we live in the system that we do. Let me say that for those representing the business community, Dr. Barfield, Ms. Overby, and Mr. Miller, I respect what you do, and you have to be part of the solution to help us fix what's wrong with our trade policy. We can't do it without you as a country. I'm in the freedom business, and so it's a different business than those you represent are in. Ms. Drake, thank you for being here on behalf of many workers who live in the district that I represent, and understanding the travails that they have experienced as a result of these trade agreements, many times having to pack up boxes with the machines and the companies in which they worked and going to a foreign country to train their replacements. Can you imagine how horrible that experience is? And so I appreciate the moment to give a little reflection here. Dr. Barfield, I agree with you that our trade policy has been used for advancing national strategic interests. Oh, do I agree with that statement? And the problem with that is that currently our trade deficits now cut about a fifth, maybe a little bit less than that, about 16.5%, 16.7% off of our GDP annually. And
Elsie, thank you.
unfortunately, it's not, trade in the aggregate is not helping us domestically. In places like I represent, the average workers lost $7,000 a year in wages. And what families are facing is extraordinarily difficult. And what's dangerous for liberty is these people aren't voting. They're not voting for Republicans. They're not voting for Democrats. They're stopping their belief that this country can work for them. So in our conversation today, I wanted to place on the record, since 1975, the country's accumulated $9.5 trillion in trade deficit. Congressman Grayson used an $11 trillion figure, so depending on which year you start with, that's pretty significant. It's never happened in this country before. That translates, using 5,000 jobs per billion, into a loss of 47,500,000 jobs. Some of the workers who haven't been able to find work live in the district that I represent. When you have something that cuts nearly a fifth of your GDP and loses that many jobs, we have a budget deficit because we have a trade deficit. And for what Ms. Overby said about savings, why would you, if you're an individual, why would you put any money in a bank today? You can't even earn 1% interest on it. So there's no incentive for savings anymore because we've doled out almost a fifth of our ability to produce. So on Mexico, let me just say, I was here when NAFTA first passed. They said we'd have trade balance. We've had trade deficits every year. For Mexico, this past year 2014, there was a $99 billion, nearly $100 billion trade deficit with Mexico. That's been the same over the last 3 years, hovering around $100 billion. For Korea, last year it was $26 billion. We were supposed to have more exports to Korea. We were supposed to get 50,000 cars into Korea while they sent 500,000 here. We never got the 50,000. I don't even know if we're up to 5,000 yet. We may be at 500. My point is that the numbers aren't working for us. If we had done it right under George Bush I and Bill Clinton, to be a freedom lover, we should have had a major transatlantic free trade agreement with countries that abide by rule of law. We didn't do that. We didn't do that. We signed agreements with places that have closed markets, that don't believe in liberty, and I can't tell you how many companies I represent that have had trouble in their dealings in China. There's no rule of law. So I'm just saying to you, as patriotic Americans, we got to fix this. We got to first support liberty, and we got to create economic agreements that work for our people. And that isn't happening. And the tragedy in the street with these people who think about national strategic interests and so forth, they forget about what happens within our own borders. The people at the National Security Council, they know every other country in the world. They sort of forget about us and what happens to the people that we represent. So I wanted to place that statement on the record. I hope that this won't be the last hearing that this committee holds. I can't believe in TPP because I've been here long enough to see what happened with NAFTA, what happened with Korea. The Jordan Accord I voted for, and that one we're still in balance. That had labor provisions, it had environmental. That might be a better measure, a better type of agreement. But we basically failed as a country when we did not uphold the rule of law. Many of you are lawyers. And when we got into agreements with countries that don't abide by the rule of law, we really got in a cul-de-sac, and we're in it till today. So I put that on the record. I hope you all have ideas about how to restore trade balance to this country, because we can't continue to hemorrhage this way. It's hurting our republic deeply. It's hurting it not, ma'am, only macroeconomically, but microeconomically on the street, the places that each of us represents a piece of the puzzle. So I appreciate the graciousness of this committee for allowing me to place that statement on the record. If anybody wants to respond and there's still time, certainly they can. Thank you.
Well, I guess I am heartened to know that it sounds as if you will support the U.S.-European Free Trade Agreement when it comes to force next year. But I'd like to go back to the point. I know we've been over this again and again, but I think on my side, I do not represent the business community. I'm a think tank. Sometimes they don't like what we say. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I'd like to, I know we have said it, but you kept coming back to whether it's NAFTA or other agreements or Jordan, whether it's in balance, that it somehow, that had to do with the standard of living in the United States. That is simply not true.
France.
As we have said, where the United States has to look in terms of our trade deficit is not with trade agreements, but our own internal policies. And the other odd thing that I'll throw in as a ringer here right at the end is that trade deficits are not necessarily evidence of non-competitiveness, nor of killing jobs. We ran in the 1990s, which is supposedly a golden period under Bill Clinton, increasing trade deficits where we had increasing job creation in the United States. Trade deficit, you have to find the circumstances. The reason we did, which is another reason we will probably have an increased trade deficit over the next couple of years if things go well for us, is that the United States was outperforming other nations. We were consuming more, and we were creating more jobs. And so the trade deficit did not, in that case, translate into some lack of competitiveness. It's likely not to do the same thing in the next couple of years if the United States keeps on the same
I would
path.
love to invite you all to the district that I represent, and we can talk trade on the street.
Happy to do it.
And it would be very enlightening, very, very enlightening. So
Sounds like it might make for a good town hall.
how about that?
There you go.
How about that?
Ms. Overby.
Meet the street. Mr. Chairman, if I could just say, because you've been so generous to me, I just want to say that in terms of the Transatlantic Alliance, if we had formed it, those nations that are unfree by any measure could have been invited to join in, and we would have raised the potential for liberty globally. We haven't done that. Look what's happened to Mexico. Just look what's happened there. And we didn't address closed markets. Go to Japan, less than 3% of the cars on their street today are from any place else in the world but Japan, and we have the most open market in the world. You can't have free trade agreements when you have closed markets and when you have state-run capitalism like is happening in China. We are really living in a false world in some ways. We're not looking at the values of liberty and rule of law in these agreements, and it is hurting us greatly, and it's hurting liberty. It's hurting liberty globally. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much.
Thank you. Ms. Overby. It's back to my time, but I'm going to let you
Thank you. Two
respond.
brief comments. On Japan and it being a closed market and the numbers on cars, I do think that TPP provides us the best opportunity that we're going to see in our lifetime to try to crack open that market. And referring to job loss, I think everyone here really needs to take a look at the fact that one of my colleagues loves to say, yes, jobs have been lost to that country called productivity, technological innovations. The world has changed. The number of people needed to make products is shrinking dramatically. That's not trade's fault. That's the technology growth that we live in a technological age. Thank you, sir.
So I have a couple of questions, but before I do, the absolutism that Representative Grayson mentioned a few minutes ago, that all these terrible things with our trade deficit have occurred coincided with the trade agreements. It's like saying, we created the Federal Department of Education in 1979. At the time, in the 1970s, we were at the top of the charts in every field, and now we're 14th in math and sciences in the world. Does that mean that the creation of the Department of Education actually made us do worse in education? I don't think that anybody's necessarily going to make that argument. I think that there are a whole host of issues that impact our trade deficit, and that's what we're talking about. You talked about a few of the issues, but I want to ask another question. If we don't participate in TPP, if the United States does not agree to participate in TPP, and China goes ahead with its plans with RCEP and their free trade agreement goes, is there anything that stops American companies from exporting jobs overseas or outsourcing then if we don't participate? Anybody care to respond to that?
There are important consequences to not concluding the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We would walk away from potential market access gains in economies that we do not now have FTAs with. There are 5 of them. There would be an immediate loss in reputation. My belief is the Obama administration has staked a great deal of prestige on the completion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and our Asian allies and friends and partners would look differently at us. In the long run, my view is that the world economy will continue to grow and
as it always has.
As it always has, and the world won't wait for us. And that I think American firms and workers are best served when America leads in writing the rules. That's been true since the Bretton Woods Conference. The U.S. has been the defender of an open rules-based trading system. It's vitally important, and for me, that's what TPP and TTIP with Europeans is a real continuation of.
So as far as my question, though, I mean, if we didn't do TPP, does that mean that jobs won't still continue to go overseas?
Well, you'll still have globalization.
That's my point.
It will be easier. With TPP, it makes it easier for us to compete, I think.
Right.
Because as we've said several times here, you know, we have lower tariffs, we have more open borders than others, with certain exceptions we ought to be clear about, and sugar and things like that. But we are the ones who are more open, so it's the rest of the world, not entirely, but to some degree. I'd like to, though, come back to a point I made at the beginning, in terms of what would happen if we don't go to the TPP. I keep coming back to the fact that the geostrategic and the geoeconomic are linked. The United States in the next few years, whoever the new president is, whatever the new Congress, whichever party has the Congress, has a good deal of heavy responsibilities around the world that are security responsibilities. There are those who argue that now we're not really committing enough resources to live up to the so-called pivot or balance. Scholars at my institute believe that. But wherever one stands on that, in that question, it is certainly true that the United States has got a lot of difficult questions to work through in terms of where it's going to put its resources, both domestic and in terms of national security over the next few years. I think this is where the trade agreements does link in. I think it will be a lot easier to persuade the Congress and the American people to support a leadership role in Asia if we are a part of a regional economic structure that is thriving and is successful for U.S. businesses and U.S. workers. And that's where they are tied together.
And finally, Ms. Kaptur made some very impassioned points, and I appreciate them, as far as liberty and freedom and the principles that we stand for. Maybe Ronald Reagan said it, the shining city on a hill. If we're not at the table, how are they impacted by the things that we believe? I think that the most important thing that we export is not a commodity. It's actually an ideal, and that ideal is freedom. It's the things that we stand for. And I don't know any relationship I've ever had with anybody, my wife, my children, friends, enemies, that I've ever improved one iota by not being at the table, by not engaging, by not being there, communicating and actively working with them. Heaven help us if what we stand for and what we believe is not a part of the equation, and if RCEP that China is pushing ends up being the free trade agreement for the region instead of what we're pushing, I far more trust the values that we advocate and the things that we stand for rather than what China stands for. Anyway, go ahead, Ms. Overby. You can
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make the comment that what happens if TPP fails? Well, then the small and medium-sized companies in America lose. Many opponents always talk about the large multinational American companies, and they will be okay one way or the other. But the SMEs,
They always seem to be.
they seem to survive. But the small and medium-sized companies, they will be grossly disadvantaged because, as we all know, our market is open. All TPP is going to do is to try to knock down some of the barriers on the other side. Tariffs are a big part of it, but it's more than tariffs. The problems these days are behind the border. Countries have gotten very creative in throwing up new non-tariff barriers, whether it's standards or rules. It makes it so hard for American companies to compete. So all we're asking for is simply our government to help us try to knock down those barriers. And if we do nothing, America loses, because the rest of the world is not going to stand by. I'm in Asia most of the year, and China is everywhere. They're very aggressive. They're pushing RCEP. They're doing all kinds of soft diplomacy, and America will lose if we do nothing.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman.
We're told that we need to be proud of these trade rules because they were made in America. These are trade rules made in America that make sure that nothing else will be made in America. We should be as proud of these trade rules as the Spaniards are of the Spanish flu. Both have wreaked incredible destruction. We're told that the president's credibility and prestige is on the line. No, his credibility and prestige is on the line with Obamacare. And those who want to save it should be advocating every day for whatever technical fixes are necessary to make sure that Obamacare goes on and subsidies are provided regardless of how the Supreme Court interprets the current draft. We are told that the only choice is between the failure we currently have and the failure that's being proposed. No one here, with the exception of Ms. Drake, even acknowledges the fact that I proposed a different trade approach. That is to say, to threaten to raise dramatically our tariffs with or without compliance with WTO as necessary to force countries to enter into fair trade agreements. We're told that there are these non-tariff barriers. And so our response is to eliminate the only barriers we have and get killed one at a time with these non-tariff barriers as if we can change this one and they've got that one. And we only see the ones they published. Most of them are on the phone where individual companies are told not to buy American goods. The way to deal with the non-tariff barriers is to have results-oriented trade agreements. Buy our stuff or don't sell in our markets. Don't think that you can benefit by playing with a procedure game and then having many of your procedures under the table. We're an open society. We can't have, they can have commissars, as they do in Vietnam, tell their companies not to buy American goods. If American congressmen were to call companies and tell them not to buy goods, we'd be laughed at. Whereas there, if there is any laughter, people can be, businesses can be sent to re-education camps. Business people can be sent to re-education camps. We're told that sometimes the trade deficit is higher. Well, the trade deficit keeps going up or is substantially and persistently high. That's true when we save. It's true when we fail to save. It's true when we have a budget deficit of over $1 trillion. It's true when we have a huge surplus. It's true when we have a huge surplus and are saving, and our trading partners are running 3, 4, 5% of GDP deficits, and they are not saving. The only thing that remains the same is we always have a trade deficit no matter what we do if we keep the same trade policies. One exception. If we're willing to have a calamity of the type we had in 2008, then we get to keep our same trade policies and see a reduction in the trade deficit. I suggest that we find a different way to bring down the trade deficit. I'm amazed that there is no discussion in this country of moving in a new direction. All the choice is keep the policies that have failed or double down on the policies that have failed. And finally, I think at least one witness suggested that huge trade deficits have nothing to do with jobs, that huge increases in imports cannot displace American workers. Ms. Drake, is it possible that huge increases in imports could adversely affect American workers?
It's really disingenuous to say that exports create jobs, but imports have no effect on jobs. As you said, you have to look at both sides of the equation. And quite frankly, our trade deficit represents the fact that we're consuming more than we produce. And that means there's an opportunity cost for lost jobs, either real jobs that we had that are gone, or jobs that we could have had if we produce things here. So we really do have to look at net exports, and that's the number we want to increase if we want to have good trade policy. To the chairman's point about is there anything that's preventing companies from offshoring now? No, that's the status quo. But the danger of the TPP is that it provides additional incentives to offshore so that we actually speed it. And it can do that through the ISDS mechanism by saying to those who offshore, you now have additional influence over the rules this economy makes, and if you would like to threaten it in the case that it passes a food safety law or a worker protection law, or you don't like the zoning decision that it made, you can do that. And we know that that's being used, and it's being used for exactly those kinds of things. So what we want to make sure is that the TPP provides the right rules that actually incentivize manufacturing here. And trade can be done right. Congressman Kaptur said you know, she supported the U.S.-Jordan Free Trade Agreement. So did the AFL-CIO. I think if we look at how Germany does trade, if we look at how Sweden does trade, they do a lot of exporting in an advanced economy, and they haven't seen the extensive job losses that we have. When you look at productivity, to Ms. Overby's point, when productivity increases, workers should do better. They're contributing more, their firm's making more money, they should get a part of it. But what we've seen is a complete decoupling of worker productivity and wages. And that's not, it's in the United States, but it's not just here. And it does have to do with globalization, because if we set up rules that make it much easier for firms to say, hey, take this pay cut, or we're moving, and we do that in every country, firms can game countries. Who's got the weakest environmental regulations? Who's going to pay the lowest wages? And that's not good for workers or businesses, because in the end, what businesses want are middle classes who can be consumers, who can buy things. And when we have such a demand shortage here because of wage stagnation, and you have it elsewhere, we have a problem exporting more goods because there aren't folks who can buy them. And just to one last point on fast track and the full transparency. Again, I would say be really careful, because fast track in the past has always been for a time period, 4 years or 5 years or something like this. So trade agreements can be negotiated that weren't even thought of when the fast track was granted. Think about how Korea was negotiated right at the very end of President Bush's fast track term. That was not something that Congress had contemplated when they passed the fast track deal, and I would dispute that it was well negotiated. We think it was rushed, we think it left jobs on the table, and we think the extraordinarily increasing deficits that we've seen just in the first couple of years of Korea are evidence that something's really wrong with that agreement. So I think we can do better, and that's really what we're here to say. One last thing, I don't think the question is if the TPP fails. I think the question is how to do the TPP. The U.S. has entered into trade negotiations before that have failed, with Malaysia, with Thailand, with Europe a couple of times. But we still have stature. I think the question is, how do we do this right? Not pull out, not cede space to China, but do things that are good for workers in China and the U.S., and that'll be good for all of us.
I think my time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, but I can't thank you enough and the ranking member for allowing me to be here today and to listen to the witnesses. I appreciate your collegiality.
Thank you. I'm going to just close by saying that I got this from the Korea Economic Institute of America. This is just my district. It's not the entire country, but the Arizona 5th District merchandise exports to Korea went to 18.6 million. It grew 28.5% from 13. In the service exports grew 13.2% to 24.3 million from 12, and the jobs related to trade with Korea in my district are 297. So, you know, I understand there's going to be other dialogue. This isn't the last hearing on TPP. We'll have lots of other hearings. I really appreciate the comments. I appreciate the loyal opposition. That's the way it's supposed to be. And we appreciate the wonderful job that everybody on the panel did. And without objection,
Mr. Chairman, just make them get you import statistics for your district as well, so you can lay them next to each other. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you very much.